All right. Hello, everyone. This is day one of the Product Growth Conference. So just so everyone's in the loop, this is a two-day event. The second day is tomorrow from 1 to 5 p.m., and it's at Berkeley SkyDeck, so you guys are more than welcome to come to that as well. The link for that is also on the Luma. And so we have a lot of exciting things planned for today, so I'll go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Zimran Rahman. I'm the president of Piedmont Consulting Group. We are a student organization with over 50 members, and we work with startups, and we put 8 to 10 Berkeley students on a project, and it's like having a bunch of Berkeley interns working for you for a school semester. And just about the agenda, we'll be doing a 45-minute speaker panel with a Q&A, and then we'll also have 3 startups pitching for the event, and then a Q&A for that, and then the panelists will give a live feedback on each pitch. And before we get started with the panel conversation, I'd like to introduce the organizations that we're partnering with. So the first one is Honest Product Growth Studio, which they'll go ahead and tell a little bit about themselves and the goal for this conversation. So we can give a round of applause for Honest as well.
I feel like I just won an Oscar walking down the aisle right there. Hey everybody, thanks for showing up today. Really appreciate it. We're super excited for the day. This is stuff that Sam and I nerd out about all the time. But before I say anything else, special thanks to Zemron and the rest of PCG and everybody else that's been involved with this. I think everybody here has probably been involved in some event setups in the past and know how tough they can be, but these guys have killed it. So really appreciative of them and everybody else involved. Yeah, hell yeah, thank you. Yeah. Clap for that, thank you. Next, a little bit about us. So Sam and I started Honest Product Studio late last year, and we come from a background of working with a lot of startups on product growth strategies. And so we've been applying a lot of these strategies that we've learned over the course of our years working with companies and helping to try to get them scaled through more efficient means than to the most efficient means that we can help with. So super excited for the day. Let's go.
Let's do it.
All right, thank you, Sam and Alex. And then just a quick thank you to the sponsors. So we wouldn't have been able to do this event without our 2 sponsors. So next, Alumni Ventures. We don't have a representative for them today, but I'll just give a quick summary of what they do. So they are the #1 most active VC fund in the United States over the last 2 years, according to PitchBook. They're the largest VC fund in America for individuals. And they have a branch of the firm called Strawberry Creek Ventures that only invests in Berkeley founders. So if you are a Berkeley founder, definitely reach out to them. And next sponsor is Edge Case Capital Partners, which we have Jessica to represent them. So we give a round of applause.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you all here today. My name is Jessica Owens. I am the senior analyst at Edge Case Capital Partners. Edge Case is a Gen Z-backed venture capital firm that writes $25,000 to $50,000 check sizes. And yeah, come find me and say hi, and thank you so much, Zimran.
Thank you, Jessica. And so now we'll begin with the panelist conversation. And we will begin with Sam Gimbel. So Sam Gimbel has been leading product teams in New York City since 2010. He was the first product hire at Drama Fever in 2012, at DigitalOcean in 2014. He co-founded and sold Clark, a SaaS platform for tutoring businesses, in 2019. Since then, he has built product teams in the SMB and FinTech, most recently as VP of Product Growth at Clover Networks, where he led point of sale and consumer efforts. So let's give a round of applause for Sam. Next is Alex Meredith. He's been scaling early stage startups for the last 15 years as an executive operator and advisor, and has been a key member of 4 acquired venture-backed startups. Prior to starting Honest with Sam, Alex served as the director of product growth at Clover Networks and the VP of growth at Minibar Delivery. Just give a round of applause for Alex. So Sam and Alex are the moderators for the conversation, so now I'll introduce the 3 panelists. begin with Nathan Trueblood. So he's an entrepreneur, advisor, and technology leader with over 30 years of experience in enterprise SaaS, big data, and cloud computing. Nathan is an expert in creating high-performing product teams and has served in executive leadership roles at Dell EMC, Yahoo, Western Digital, and most recently at Box.com. Today, Nathan serves as an advisor and executive coach to founders and startup companies through UC Berkeley's SkyDeck program. Let's give a round of applause to Nathan. Our second panelist is Anna Tutckaia. She's the VP of Growth Marketing at ManyChat, has grown the platform to over 2 million businesses and creators, skyrocketing annual recurring revenue past $50 million. With a decade of startup experience, she also advises emerging tech companies. And by night, Anna coaches individuals using Silicon Valley startup tactics to drive personal and professional success. So let's give a round of applause for Anna. All right, last but not least, we have Steven Jian. Steven Jian, he's a veteran of the games industry whose career and work have both evolved alongside the rise of free-to-play games in the United States. After working at Zynga during the early days of the social games boom, he has since founded multiple gaming startups, including a mobile game business that was acquired for $170 million. So I'll hand it over to Sam and Alex to begin the conversation.
Thank you, sir. First off, guys, thank you for being here. We've been super excited to get this all together. We've all had a few chances to chat and get to know each other a bit, but I think the really exciting thing is just having this group, this panel in front of you guys today to talk about some really fun, exciting stuff. We've all had experience scaling companies and scaling companies in different ways. And that said, there's a lot of commonalities in how we've scaled them. But so yeah, we're all super excited to introduce these guys, get these guys up here so we can all have a really fun conversation about this stuff today. So let's just jump right into it. This is a conference about product-led growth. A lot of people have heard that term. It gets thrown around a lot, especially over the last couple of years. But there's still a lot of questions about what exactly that means. So I'd like to throw it to you guys. How do we think about product-led growth? How do we kind of define it today?
I'll start with the slightly silly answer, which is we try to put labels on a lot of things, and product-led growth is definitely a thing, and there's a lot of semantics, and people debate, what is that really the way to describe it? As someone who's been doing startups for a long time, I really think of these as practical techniques for hacking growth when money is tight. And so we put labels on them later when these frameworks work. But for me, a lot of product-led growth is what do you do when you don't have a ton of money for a sales team? Or how can you make sure that you're driving massive adoption in the early days of your company? So I tend to stay a little bit away from formal definitions and more focus on what is the point. So that's kind of how I look at it.
I think that's super important because, Nathan, I'm so glad that this is the first thing we said about it. We talk about PLG, that name gets thrown around a lot, but it's important not to get too caught up in the semantics. I think exactly what you said, Nathan, like there's a lot of ways to scale companies, but how do you do it efficiently? And there's smart ways to scale companies, and there are other ways to scale companies. And
expensive.
Exactly. And I think one of the benefits, I think, in the last couple of years, we've seen the environment, the funding environment change quite a bit, is that you see more and more companies kind of moving towards a smarter approach.
To add a little bit to that is also thinking from the product perspective, how you're building the product, so the product sells itself. And a little bit from the marketing perspective is how do you build the marketing acquisition engine for this product that is not drives all the leads and all the traffic to the sales team, which usually does not exist within product-led growth company, but drive it directly to the product, which has all the capacity to push this traffic down the funnel to convert and retain the users within the cycle.
Yeah, I think in our experience with games, our constraints kind of pushed us into product-led growth, or the techniques of product-led growth, because we didn't have that much money when we started our first company, and so we couldn't do just direct user acquisition. And so product-led growth kind of naturally fit there. And then when we think about what a successful game is in our space, we're talking about games that have over 100 million players. You know, anything between the product and the audience, like any step there, is not going to scale enough to serve 100 million players. Even if you just had to press a button to accept everyone coming into your game, you couldn't press it 100 million times. So it has to be product-led and kind of like self-serve and all the aspects of product-led growth.
So, all right, this is super interesting because, you know, when we think about product-led growth, I think most people in this audience, if you've dug into PLG at all, the examples you typically see in the market are usually B2B SaaS companies. But a lot of those tactics are, have been learned over time from other industries, gaming being one of them. I mean, PLG at the end of the day is a lot about engagement. How do you find and optimize engagement within your product and really expose your product really early on that's in a way that's most beneficial to the user? But I think gaming is probably one of the original industries to really identify that and master it. But it's really interesting in particular, Steven, because saying that you guys didn't focus on UA to start, and if there's any industry that knows UA, it's the gaming industry. So
What's UA, Alex?
Oh, thank you, Nathan. User acquisition. We were joking about this earlier. We've got to keep each other on our toes. So you guys, instead of going the user acquisition route in gaming, you guys are more focused on PLG, but how did you guys go about that?
Yeah, so at the beginning, I mean, even when we started, this was in 2013. It's pretty early mobile days, but even then it was starting to heat up the user acquisition costs. And we're talking about like $6 to $10 per install. And when we're trying to get millions of players, that's out of our budget. So we had to figure out ways to grow without just direct marketing like that. And so a lot of it was focusing on the product. We did get organic traffic through the app stores and things like that, but it was a trickle. And so we really had to keep the players in there and then use them to acquire more people through viral loops and kind of word of mouth type stuff. And so, yeah, it was, again, born out of the lack of budget for marketing. So we did that. And UA has only gotten more expensive on, especially in mobile. So I'm a huge fan of not paying that tax.
Go ahead.
I was going to tell a little story, kind of as Anna pointed out. One aspect of product-led growth is thinking about how your marketing's driving not necessarily to a salesperson, right, but to something more like you're nurturing your user, your prospective customer, ultimately through self-service, and they're going to buy or at least reach out to you when they're pretty close. So my little story there, kind of like you too, Steven, was I was at a startup. Many of you are at a startup. Raised some money, super excited about that. Before I got there, though, actually, they blew all their money on really expensive salespeople. So they had customers. We had a good product. We couldn't afford any more salespeople, or we were going to run out of money. So what do you do? And so that was where we weren't necessarily thinking product-led growth. We're like, oh my God, this product has to sell itself. How are we going to get customers to understand the value here, and how can we create leverage to actually get to something that looks like a sale without putting someone on a plane to go have 12 meetings with them?
I want to dig in a little bit more there. I think that's really interesting. The theme of both of actually everything that's been said so far is that product-led growth is primarily driven by constraint. And whether that's financial or scale, if you think about the focus of scale, it is about the constraint of understanding your ideal customer and only going after that person and finding a way to get enough of those people. I'm just curious, what are some other examples that you have where I want more stories like yours, really, these small anecdotes where it was something just very unexpected that led you to a growth path that ended up yielding fruit, bearing fruit is the saying. Sorry.
Did you say yelling fruit?
I don't know what I said, Alex.
Oh. Fruit.
Came out. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can tell the story not from the perspective of constraint of the budget, because I once found myself at a situation where I had a ton of budget that I could spend to push the market, to push the product out to the market. And my plan as a marketer was to rely solely on the marketing channels and primarily on paid media channels like Facebook ads, Instagram ads, Google ads. And the product was nicely built by our amazing product team. Like the launch date was there. I'm launching all these ads with the team, and they're ineffective. It's like what we are learning that the market itself isn't ready for those ads to be served. There was a lot of negative connotation around chatbots, a lot of negative connotation about automation through social media channels. So we just couldn't spend, we couldn't use those marketing dollars, and we started thinking like, what can we do? How can we build this awareness and that will translate itself into those growth loops? So we started this whole route of bringing in people who already have a lot of awareness in the market, influencers, thought leaders, and the idea was not to ask them to promote the product, but really make them use the product and get them excited about the product, because we were huge believers in it, and we knew that once they start seeing the value, they would want to educate their users no matter what. And the whole marketing team, instead of building out the gazillion of landing pages and optimizing the ads, we were pretty much like business development people, like trying to find those thought leaders and making connections. And the thing is, once they got excited about the product, they started talking about themselves. They started building courses around the product, and the more they did it, the more people started using the product. And since it's all in social, the more other people started seeing that in action. And once that happened, only after that, all the marketing tactics were actually valuable, just because people were like, okay, now we trust it.
So this is interesting. So, you know, Anna, something you just hit on, the word of mouth aspect. And, you know, for us in our industry, talking specifically viral loops, which, Steven, that's something you just brought up a little bit ago. When you guys think about viral loops, that can be a tough game for a lot of people to optimize, for a lot of industries to optimize, as anyone who's ever gone through it knows. Especially if we really start nerding out about like K factors and all that fun stuff. But curious how you guys have kind of played that game a little bit. Steven, I know in the gaming industry that's a huge thing, so just curious.
Yeah, I mean, viral loops are so dependent on the channels that you're operating on and how they work. Like, is this a game that's integrated with your chat, or is it on Facebook, or is it, yeah, something that streams well? It's pretty tough to create a really good viral loop. So we're always trying to just create any little viral loop. Any little bit will help if we could bump that K factor. I mean, if you want to explain what K factor is, but I could do it. K factor is for every person that comes into your game or app, I guess, how many other people do they bring in? So it might be like 0.1, you know. So every 10 people, one extra person will come in. And so of course you want K factor as high as possible. Maybe even crossing 1, that would be dramatic.
It's the dream.
Yeah. So, you know, any little bit we can push there just makes our other acquisition efforts just so much easier, because it's a huge multiplier.
Is there a time, especially, you know, because we got a lot of people here who are early stage founders, is there a time that a founder should or should not be thinking about viral loops and maybe focusing on other things instead? And that's open to everybody.
I would say very, very early stage. I would not think about viral loops. I would think about finding the product market fit and ideal customer persona and the match of those and the proof of those. And what I mean by the proof is initially you have a lot of hypotheses on who the audience is, what the market is, and what are the values they see in the product. But then you want to make sure they're ready to pay for the product, and you experiment with smaller groups to make sure there is the market. And then what is important is you get the social proof for those folks that they are ready to share. They're ready to share their testimonials, case studies with you that you can then test and amplify with all the viral loops or like marketing channels you're going to utilize. But before you find those two things, product market fit and ACP, there is no reason to go ahead and start thinking about the growth or scale or anything like that, because you'll be running on the treadmill, just spending money and resources.
Yeah, for us early on, retention is so key for us, because if you don't have good retention, it's just a leaky bucket. And all efforts that you put into like bringing people in, they're just gonna flow out. So retention, you got to get that to a really healthy spot before you really start thinking about anything else, in my opinion.
So I think we could all agree, that's one of the key things. When you're talking about product growth in general, that's one of the most key things there is to focus on is retention, understanding that you're figuring out ways to keep your users around. They got to keep engaging with the product. I know everyone here has thoughts on retention strategies, or when to focus on retention, or maybe when not to focus on retention on a small team. But I'm going to open that one up. Sam, I know you and I have conversations about this stuff all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the time in product growth conversations, it's easy to conflate retention with just the product itself. And to say like, oh well, retention is the goal or the purpose of the product team of all the engineering efforts that we have. But the way that we've talked about it in the past, and we'll probably continue to talk about it, is that it's really one unified effort. The marketing team is trying to bring in leads that are willing to purchase and then be retained. The customer support team, the customer success teams, et cetera, are all trying to focus around, this one North Star that, is really sort of defining what our success is going to look like in the long term. So I think, just to ask this question again that Alex was getting at, especially in the early stages of a company, when we think we're reaching where we're moving towards product market fit, but maybe we're not, which means we haven't, by the way. If it's not clear, you haven't reached it. How do we think about balancing retention efforts, versus the acquisition side of the game, and is it really a binary?
I have two immediate comments about this, especially coming from, those of you who were paying attention, I was at Box.com, which is a massive B2B SaaS company. And you'd think the answer to your question, Alex, at most companies would be sort of obvious, that retention is really important. But oftentimes what you find is so much of the organization is focused around acquiring new customers. And acquiring users, let's be clear, is super important. But from a B2B SaaS perspective, if you look at, say, Box is a pretty big company, $1 billion in revenue. How much net new revenue is coming from? How much of that revenue is coming from new deals versus existing renewals, retention? It's actually like 80% comes from retention of existing customers, and maybe 10 or 20% is expansion with new customers. So when you think of it like that, retention becomes incredibly important, especially because it can be so expensive to acquire customers. And so everyone that leaves, it's the leaky bucket we were mentioning earlier, everyone that leaves is a big challenge. So my perspective on this is retention is super important, and you shouldn't get too over-indexed on only acquiring new deals and not taking care of your existing customers. So that's one answer. The more nuanced answer, I would say, for early stage is a little bit more like this. Acquiring customers, acquiring users, super important. But as Anna pointed out, maybe you don't, you need to know what your ideal customer profile is. And in the early days, you may not have a very good idea about that. But as that starts to become more clear, as you're engaged more with your customers and you start to see signal, then you're like, actually, there are some kinds of customers here that may not be ones that we want to retain. But that should be a strategic decision as opposed to just letting them slide. Because for everyone who's doing early stage, at some point, a potential investor is going to say, okay, great, how many customers do you have? Can I talk to them? And so, you want to have a lot of user love, especially in the early days.
And I have a story about when retention was useful, even when we couldn't monetize or turn into revenue for the business. So early on in the mobile games company, we built a lot of games. We were just building tons of games. We were putting a new one out every couple months. We were just trying different games in different categories and trying to find product market fit, basically. I mean, in the games industry, you're trying to find a hit, but it's basically product market fit. And we took this kind of shotgun approach to it. But all of our games had really good retention. We had 60%, 70% D1, which was really good for mobile games, especially free-to-play games. And what ended up happening for us that we didn't really...
D1 is day one, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Who comes back one day after they install it. And then there's D7 and D, et cetera. So we built these 30 games before we found a hit. So we did find a hit eventually. It took 2 years. We found a hit. And that hit was the monetization, LTVs, lifetime value of players in that game was so much higher than everything else we built. But all those other games, we had great retention, and we built them to be very hands-off. We didn't have all this server infrastructure we had to think about. So we just let them be there. And when we found the hit, we realized these other games would be a great cross-promo source into our game. And so we turned on this cross-promotion into the really well-performing game, and that was huge for us. I mean, it was 500 to 1,000 installs a day, for example. And at the time, $10 an install, $10,000 a day worth of free acquisition or acquisition we built up before. They weren't doing anything for us in those other games because those games just couldn't monetize. We just didn't build them right, or it wasn't the right type of game. But once we got them into the right game, it was huge. And so $10,000 every day of the year, that's millions and millions of dollars of user acquisition that we didn't have to pay for. And it was all because the retention was there. If those games weren't retaining and we just abandoned them, then they would do nothing for us. But it was kind of a nice coincidence that they were there and we could utilize this foundation of games to push our successful game.
One thing to add about retention, not even about retention, because I really like how you, Steven, said the leaky bucket analysis. And when we're thinking about growth, we're thinking about this leaky bucket that happens within the product, right? Within the user that we already acquired and that started using the product. But I really want to highlight that there are so many steps before the user gets in the product where a lot of this leaky bucket happens. And before going scale, I recommend startups building out the funnel, and you can do it within any spreadsheet, and highlighting every step of the funnel. Usually only the registration process can take up to 5 to 10 steps, and building out strong analytics and seeing, okay, out of 100% of the people that get to the website, how many of those people click on the sign up button? And then how many people choose the channel, or how many people leave their email address? And really looking at it holistically and seeing where the majority of the people drop off and how can you fix there and how can you bring them back to this funnel, because a lot of leakage happens right there. So you have more people to work on, and then slice and dice this data and see what do you know about these people, who of these people are less stable in terms of going through your, let's say, challenging registration process. Sometimes it's not only fixing the bucket, but also figuring out what are the best audience to serve this bucket to. So getting really deep with the data is very important.
What's up, Sam?
I'm just looking at the list of questions again. You go ahead.
Yeah. So that just broke my thought.
Well, I have a story going back a little bit to earlier part of the conversation, because Anna, you were talking about you had all this marketing money to spend, and you realized if I spent it on advertising, it would be a total waste because people weren't ready for advertising. I think that actually kind of maps to what a lot of you all are probably facing from a startup perspective. I've made a lot of products over the years built for software engineers or technical people who are insanely allergic to anything that looks like advertising, right? So then what do you do? And so, so two stories about that. One is, Anna, in your world, you were talking about influencers, right? So one of the things,
or thought leaders,
thought leaders,
some people
crucial.
hate, like the
I know, and
name
yeah, it's too
influencers.
it's too Instagrammy. But we figured out as an early stage startup, there are a lot of thought leaders who are hungry for content to make them continue to be thought leaders, and so we were quite aggressive in going out to everyone that we thought was a thought leader influencer to our target users and pitch them content. Because let's be honest, all of us are fundamentally lazy, and if you're running one of these things, it's like an entrepreneur comes to you and says, hey, I've got this really interesting perspective, this article, I've already written it mostly, we can finish it together and then you can publish it. So then they become more of a thought leader, and you're just standing close to their light to cast a bigger shadow. So the punchline of this story is actually this particular company, when we ended up getting acquired, I remember the big company that acquired us said, my God, we thought you guys were this huge company. Everywhere we went, we were reading articles from you guys, and like, how was that possible? And it was all because of this somewhat of a guerrilla or hacker approach of just pitch content to all the thought leaders. Now, you're not just, it has to be meaningful, it has to be a point of view, but oftentimes as a startup, you have a point of view. So I call this standing close to the light to cast a bigger shadow. We cast a huge shadow on the market. No one realized it was a very small group of us in kind of a crappy office that no one knew about. But we sure seemed big online. So that's one way to think about it.
Having a point of view and having a perspective as a startup, I think, is really key, and that's the part that resonates for me from that story, among the other parts, like being able to sell a company that seems larger than than maybe it's amazing when what you're able to do with when you can sort of control the story.
Yeah,
and the
our
message.
customers, to be clear, didn't want to buy from a startup. Too risky, too scary, but so we weren't a startup anymore because we were everywhere.
And there you go. So you knew you identified a sort of message and customer fit in that way. And I think that at some point, every startup has to make a choice. What is our perspective? What's our point of view on the value we're going to provide to this user? We have to decide who the user is. We have to build the value, and we have to make sure that it matches up. And we can talk about measuring, the funnel to see how well we are matching those two things up. But honestly, at some point when I was building my startup, and it's actually a little bit of background here, I hired Alex as my head of growth at a company in 2017 because I was getting lost in the weeds. It was an SMB operational platform for small education companies. And I had no idea what it meant to be successful for that, specifically around how I could measure the success of the business itself. So as we're talking about product-led growth, as we're talking about growing a startup that's very small, that hasn't reached product market fit, and you're testing things out with different users, how can you anchor yourself in reality, right? Like, how can you use measurements? Are there specific concepts that we might be able to employ to sort of figure out how close we are to the light, so to speak, or how close we are to true north? And so sometimes what we'll call that, and by sometimes I mean constantly, Alex and I talk about this idea of the North Star metric. And you've probably heard it from VCs, or you've heard it in other talks and that sort of thing. I think it tends to get diluted a little bit in conversation, but I do want to talk a little bit about that. So as we're thinking about growing our funnel and analyzing at every phase, how do we know when those acquisitions have actually become sort of successful customers? What do North Stars look like in your own work?
I can start off here. So the main North Star for us is ARR, annual recurring revenue, and that is combined of two main metrics, which is net new paying accounts growth every month, and also user retention of those accounts within the cycle. And the way we like to treat it is the growth and growth marketing team are focused on net new paying accounts growth, and day in and day out we are measuring how many new folks we are bringing in the funnel and what is our CAC, so how much we pay for those accounts to come in. And then on the product side of things, they're solely focusing on retention. Like, what do they do within the product so the users get to the first aha moment, so they get activated faster, and then what does the product need to do to retain them further down the funnel? So that's how we also redistribute the ownership within the organization.
I think for games, retention is probably the highest one for me. Like, it's tempting to say LTV or lifetime value, but if you have good retention, you can get there. You can like push up your LTV over time. You can develop it, make the game better. The tough part is that, at least with games and entertainment, there's this concept of the golden cohort, which is this first group of people that come, they love your game, they're like the most retaining, most well-paying group. And every group after that is going to be slightly worse. And then each cohort will be worse than the last. And so you're fighting this like downwards trend. So if you can flatten it out, that would be wonderful and just not like crash into the ground. But it is entertainment, you know, people that are drawn to what you're serving, well, they'll find it. And then, so you have to search farther to like find the people that will be into it, and the numbers just get worse and worse over time. So flattening out retention across the cohorts was kind of a goal for us.
I'm actually curious, Steven, when you're looking at those groups within the retention, what group are you mostly focused on? Like the top group that is highly retained, or somewhere in the middle, or somewhere at the bottom that you want to bring them up, or somewhere at the bottom you're like, I don't care about, that's not my ICP, and let them churn within the next 2 days? How do you differentiate like the focus?
I think if I think back to how we were operating like a year into the game, we did think a lot about the new cohorts. So we were trying to get them up to at least be as, the golden cohort almost took care of themselves. They just like got locked into our game. They loved it. Everything was positive about it. So we didn't have to worry about them too much. But it was the newer groups that were just a lot weaker. And that moving number of retention and LTV really made it hard to predict, user acquisition, payback periods, and things like that. And so we always tried to stabilize it.
Makes sense.
I think of North Star metrics, maybe because I'm a product manager, I think of it from a little bit different perspective, which is, at least from a product North Star metric perspective, what is the proxy for the value you're creating for your user? It's really pretty simple, although identifying the metric is not so simple. But like, what is that metric? What's that proxy that says, if my user is doing more of this, they're getting more value from me? And what can we do to amplify that behavior? It sounds really obvious, but it's quite hard to do. So a few things I think about from startup perspective is, what is that proxy? And are you doing something in your product? Can you do something to instrument and find out when you're getting that right? So you really want to be clear on that from the early days, because if you are not clear what the value is that you're delivering, no matter how many users you're acquiring, the value may be very different across those different customers. Back to product growth, you're trying to create growth loops, but those are usually loops around a particular kind of value and a particular kind of user, maybe in a particular community. So you want to think about that proxy for value. And then a little story about Box, for example. Now Box is a massive SaaS company, but any enterprise B2B SaaS company, everyone in SaaS says weekly active users, like it's like a religion, WAU or MAU, monthly active users, and everyone just says this. What we realized was, yes, of course, it's reported to the board, everyone wants to know how many users are logging into your product. But the reality was actually a little more nuanced. It turns out it's really not about who's logging in, how active are they. It's really more important, what are they doing on there? Because we quickly realized like a lot of users log in and like, yeah, nothing to do here, and they log out. So we looked at things like engagement, which is a big word, a lot of things about engagement, but it was literally how long are they on there? How many different things did they do? How deep did they go? And you know, sort of what was the depth of that interaction? That was a huge predictor of retention, value, potential for expansion with that customer, and so forth. So all I'm really saying is get clear on your product metric, and then think about how you're going to try to instrument for that. Can you instrument your product? Can you gather information from your users that are going to tell you how often are they doing the thing that is valuable about your product?
To piggyback on that,
No, you, Hannah, go ahead.
yeah, I really like that, especially when you can find this product metric that could be shareable with others. So in our case, and that's how you build those viral loops. In our case, it was monthly active conversations where we would measure how many automations and conversations would go out from the user to their followers and back. And then the cool thing is we would do the board where we would highlight, you know, the top users with those highest monthly active conversations, and we would flag it and prepare the ready to share message so they can go ahead and share it with their followers, with their communities, something for them to brag about. And they went ahead, they did it, and then they brought new people inside the platform.
I'm getting goosebumps from what you guys are talking about right now, especially Nathan, when you were just talking about like the product metrics. This is the stuff I nerd out about so hard, it's ridiculous. It's a problem. So
It is actually a problem.
it is, yeah.
We should talk about it.
This is actually therapy for Alex here today.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. That's off stage. No, but one of the things that, you know, I have worked with a lot of companies on, it's something that Sam and I work with a lot of companies on right now, is trying to figure out what that North Star metric is, because it's so important. And for Nathan, the way that you described it is exactly right. Like if you can identify that metric really early on, understand that that metric that's clearly providing value for the user. And Anna, you mentioned an aha moment earlier, and it's like, what is that aha moment? Is that the moment that's providing that value to the user? And how does that align up with the rest of your company's goals, your revenue goals, and everything else? Oftentimes, I mean, probably 9 times out of 10 when I talk to a company and we have a North Star metric conversation, if we ask, like, what's your North Star? The first thing they say is revenue. Your user doesn't give a shit about your revenue. Like, they want your product to still be around, but like they generally don't care if you're making money or not. There's something else in your app that's much more important to them, or whatever your business is, it's much more important. Find out what that is and use that as your guiding point, your North Star, to help drive growth in your company.
I can't help but share why North Star metric is hard. You still need to do it. All of you who are founders, you really have to think deeply about this. It's especially complicated in an enterprise. So when we sit here and go, yeah, identify your North Star product metric, everyone's like,
It's
yeah,
hard.
we should,
Yeah, it's
we
hard.
should do that. Yeah, duh. But when you start to dig into it, it gets complicated because maybe for your user, you have one metric of value, but that your user may not be your economic buyer. And so what you look at from a metric perspective could be very different. And now you're on the slippery slope of what are we optimizing for? So, for example, I do a lot of products and tools and things like that for engineers, and oftentimes it's about making them more productive. And I'm really sorry to say most companies don't really spend money on making engineers more productive. So oftentimes, like, what you're doing is, well, we're measuring what the engineer is doing and how often, because that's a measure of value for them, but we also have to be tracking what is the result of that user engineer doing, what is the result of that for the business where they work. So, for example, more productivity might, or you know, maybe right now I'm working with a testing company. Maybe writing more tests or making engineers more productive in doing that is a metric of their value, but what the buyer cares about is actually reduced incidents where the site goes down or shipping features faster. And so this is a classic problem where you may have to think a little bit about, yeah, my North Star metric for my user is still this, but how does that relate to what my buyer cares about, which may be a different metric?
And this is the tricky thing about products and growth being sort of the same thing, right? You're providing value, but we only get to provide more value if somebody pays us to do it. And it's aligning those incentives that's so difficult. Ultimately, you can sort of help yourself earlier in the journey by identifying your North Star as soon as you can to understand how it actually does impact sort of your economic future. So as a business, if we think that the best thing that we can do is provide, in the case of Clark, the company was matching tutors and students. So it was the number of sessions that were matched. If we look at that, that's actually very well aligned. The number of sessions that are matched is value for both customers, and it's money in our pocket. So great, that's awesome. But if you look at something like Facebook in the earlier, or in the middle eras, before it was Meta, the user incentive to continue using it and the actual business incentive to keep growing that company started to really diverge. And they had to, change. Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly where they are right now. So we'll leave that one right there. But the point is, because the North Star is such an expression of the perspective that you have on your company, it has to be a perspective of its business future and its value. And finding those two things that that actually link up in that way is extremely difficult. So a lot of the time we do look at rather than looking right at the thing, we look sort of around it, and we look at engagement in different ways. We look at revenue over here, or where we become happy with a leaky bucket in some way, because maybe the economics of the business are working out, but the value we're providing isn't lasting, or the opposite.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to turn this into maybe a practical tip. So you identify your North Star product metric, but we're here talking about product growth. So once you have that product metric identified, then what? Then you go find the audience in the situation where perhaps if you get your message right, the story right to that audience in that community, whatever that is, we're looking for that, hey, this set of users is actually driving that product metric. What did we do right there? Can we do more of that and start to get that going? But it may be slightly different users, slightly different use cases. It may still be your ideal customer profile. But I think that's kind of the practical tip here is you identify that metric, and then you're looking for strategies on how to amplify behavior that looks like they're getting more value.
You took the words out of my mouth. I'm so glad we were able to talk about North Star metric stuff today, because it is so important for companies to figure out early on. And you can figure out your North Star metric, and especially early on, it can be wrong. Ideally, it's not, obviously, but it can be wrong. But the important thing is you learn from it, and if you need to adjust, if you need to pivot from that one to a new one, that you're able to do it. But you've been able to focus on that and test it out and try it and make sure that's either the right direction or the wrong direction, ideally quickly.
So most people get it wrong the first time. Most people end up experimenting a lot. And waking up every day as the founder of a startup and trying to decide what you're going to experiment with is terrifying and exhausting, and that's why only a few of them succeed and a lot of them fail. Well, one reason. What tips do we have for founders who are trying to find those different growth techniques for how to sort of organize their thinking around growth experimentation? Not to put you on the spot or anything. I can share one that failed while you're thinking, if that's helpful. So I was early at DigitalOcean, a cloud hosting provider. And one of the things that they noticed early on was that a large number of their users were being acquired by word of mouth. Cool. But they had no idea why or where those people were talking about it. I had joined after their Series A, which was very highly publicized. We thought maybe it was around that. Long story short, we ended up giving one of those massive cloud hosting allowances to like every Y Combinator startup or something like that. And the worst day of my life at a company up until that point was sitting and trying to figure out why the back end would stop working when we were trying to apply credits to people's accounts, because it was hundreds of thousands of people coming through and doing that. And at the end of the day, we realized that 6 months later, none of those customers were any better than our other customers who were coming in through other sort of word of mouth, channels. So we learned nothing as a result. And we cost ourselves some multiple of, I think the allowance was $250K or something like that. That had to be written down somewhere and written off in some way financially down the road.
So I think there's this advice that if something is painful or scary, just do it more. Do smaller pieces of it more.
If you're going through hell, keep going.
And so I think we really had a lot of that. So we just ran lots of experiments all the time and tried a lot of different things. And that made the sting of failure just fade away, because we were like failing nonstop until we succeeded. And so that helped a lot. And there's all this general advice in startups to go fast, and OODA loops, the warfare techniques to go faster and observe faster, and all these sorts of things. And they are very valuable, because it really just makes it, you master trying new things and observing what's going on and doing it better. And every failure doesn't hurt that much, because, again, it's happening all the time.
In our case, and working with startups, what I find is helpful to have a large backlog of all the hypotheses that could potentially get you to growth. So there are like no bad ideas out there. But the caveat to that is all this backlog of hypotheses should be backed by some sort of data, because what you end up doing is having just a list of ideas, especially if you have more people on the team, or especially if you have a lot of advisors, just keep throwing you things on the table. So there is some research needs to happen before it actually gets on this list. And then there are 3 criteria you can analyze by deciding where do you want to go first. Like the first one is on the scale from 1 to 10, how far do you think will move the needle, like the experiment? How many resources do you need to make it happen? And how long will it take to implement the experiment? And then you have some average number associated with every hypothesis, and you just go with it. I think to your point, the most important thing is to act fast. Just to give you an idea, I am advising one of startups in AI within mortgage industry. And a month ago, we just threw multiple ideas on the table, like how can we get new customers acquired? And those are large B2B customers. And one of the ideas was launch podcast and start inviting those potential leads as speakers, just because people love being on stage and sharing ideas. And the second one was to let's see if events work and start attending events. And what we learned is it takes way more time to put up the podcast on the go, and people that were, getting acquired weren't the right leads, versus just attending like 2 events generated so many leads. So very quick experiment, learning right there, and then go ahead and start increasing that, seeing whether they acquired the right leads.
I just want to put emphasis on what Anna said about hypotheses, which is kind of a couple things I want to say here. Yes, identify those hypotheses that you want to test with your customers, 100%, and you need to understand what's the cost of these different things. Oftentimes, from a product perspective, those hypotheses become features, and those features become things that you ship as a proxy for creating value. Well, we had a hypothesis, so we shipped the thing, job done. You see companies do this constantly. To me, shipping a feature is a very expensive way to test a hypothesis. Once you've shipped it, now is where you actually start measuring whether it worked or not. Not when you guys all got together in a room and decided to ship the feature. So I think being clear on what are the hypotheses we want to test, what's the cost of doing them, and how will we measure if it's working or not. And oftentimes you can measure you can evaluate that hypothesis without having to spend many weeks of writing code. And so there's a startup I'm thinking of right now who might have to build a bunch of hardware and a bunch of software and do a whole bunch of stuff to test a hypothesis about the way their user might interact with their product. And one of the suggestions was like, do you need to do all of that? Can you test this hypothesis in some other super cheap, janky way? But it would at least start to get you some data before you go and spend all that money on engineering and software development and so forth. So just want to emphasize hypotheses are not just ideas you ship. It's right. You want to be really clear, how hard is this and what's the benefit and how will we measure once we ship? Because there's so many companies, all of us are using products right now. You look at it and you're like, what were they doing? Why did they give me this feature? Are they even did they even pay attention after they shipped it?
I'm glad you brought it up, the tools, because there are so many tools right now that you can utilize to test out your early MVPs, like usertesting.com. Helio is another one where you can also use another AI tools to put together those MVPs very quickly, ship it to those user testing tools and get qualitative user feedback sooner rather than later before you go ahead and start, writing the code and like shipping stuff on the marketing side of things, building out all those landing pages and spending money on like traffic or like partnerships.
In the game space, I think especially for bigger games, we're seeing more and more of this trend of trying to pull forward that hypothesis validation without building a game for 3 years with a team of 50 or whatever. And so there's a lot of engagement with social media and building a community around a game that doesn't even exist yet. You're just showing concept art and you're like, hey, do you think this would be cool? And you're trying to get a heat check very early on. And because it is so expensive to just build a game for so many years and have no one care at the end. That's like the nightmare.
This is why a lot of us say the word's not product market fit, but problem market fit. And it's, again, playing with words, but we often have hypotheses. Wow, this would be a really valuable problem to solve. Let's build a whole company around solving that problem and see what happens. Instead, get out, talk to as many users and customers. What would happen if we solved this? And then you're going to find out what's really valuable. So in a funny way, Steven, what you're talking about is like, wouldn't it be cool if we built this? Well, it's expensive to test that by building it. Start to give some people an idea of what the experience would be like or what problem you'd really solve to get some signal on how valuable would it be if you could solve that. So I feel like it's a really good practice to, if you can, engage with customers or customer-like users and find out what's really valuable. What problem, if I solve this problem, what would happen? What would that mean for you?
Guys, this is some awesome information, and hopefully you guys have been able to get a lot from the experts up here. What we would like to do now is actually open things up a bit. So if anybody in the audience has any questions about anything we've talked about today, or whatever questions you have, including my therapy that apparently I need, then feel free to ask away. We've got probably about 15 minutes or so to kind of go through it. Yeah, I think you were the first hand I saw. I'll comment really quickly on that, but I want to open it up to you guys.
Do you want to just repeat the question real fast so it's on recording?
Yeah, we should just carry the mics around. Yeah, so the question, effectively, how do you instill a PLG culture in a non-PLG company? Honestly, I think it's one of the hardest things to do. I've joined companies having agreed with the CEO, like this is what we need to do, and you get in there and it's a great idea for, it sounds like they're excited about it for the first couple weeks, and then a lot of this stuff takes a lot of time to implement. It takes time, and if a CEO is not seeing results in 30 days, sometimes gets a little impatient, and it takes a lot of effort. I wish I had like a very clear-cut answer for you of like the best way to do that, but it takes. My approach has always been just a very clear-cut, upfront plan from the beginning of how you want to lay things out and what your expectations are over time, and really trying to deliver the point that this is not something that happens overnight. It takes a while to get established. But having those conversations about North Stars and everything else it takes, aha moments and everything. But it's the culture part is I think it's harder than the data piece most of the time. Personally.
I would imagine, since you're asking the question about how to change the culture, so it was initially sales-driven organization, right? And then product-led growth came into play. So I would say in this case is looking at the data and seeing how much you can scale through product-led growth and communicating this data to the team. Because what I found out, this communication piece is very important. A lot of conversations are happening within the C-suite or the exec team, where the rest of the company, they just hear the bits here and there, but they don't understand the major why. And as you know, with marketing, like people need at least 5 touch points to convert to a user. And I find it the same with the cultures within the organization. We need at least 5 touch points to get the idea, and we need to hear it from different points of view, from different people. So that's crucial. We had the same thing where we were product-led growth company, but then there was this idea of we want to become sales-driven. And it took a while looking at data and comprehending the data before going back to product-led growth.
I love this question about culture because it's so important, especially if you're talking about driving growth for your company in a particular way. So it really starts from the CEO and the leadership team. And this is a general cultural concept about companies. If you're not all bought into the mission and the approach, those little slight misalignments in the founding team show up as massive disconnects and fighting and drama elsewhere in the company. So I told the story about the company I was at that was sales-led. They spent all the money, and now what do? And so we shift to very much more of a product-led sales or product-led growth approach, but it required us first as a leadership team to align on this, and then to Anna's point, over and over and over explain why were we doing this. And if you treat people like grown-ups and you give them a strong why and they understand why you're doing this, they will buy in. And those who don't, it's a problem culturally, because you kind of all need to be pointed in the same direction. So at the company I was at before, there were some people who felt very differently and were like, no problem, but that's not what we're doing here. So you're either on the mission or maybe you're not in the company, which is pretty hard to say.
Or disagree and commit. That's the third option.
Yeah, disagree and commit. The problem with I agree. But also, most people, do you know what the opposite of disagree and commit is? I love this. Agree and subvert. Yeah, product-led growth. And so, watch out for that one.
All right, let's take the next question. That was the first one I saw, right there.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, when you're talking about, for example, validating hypotheses for growth or analyzing cohorts for retention, you're putting a lot of emphasis on data. Which type of data is important there? Is like usage metrics? Do you also take a look at feedback from users? Is actually like what users say always something you can trust or not, and you actually implement it when you are doing this analysis? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Just to repeat that question, so you're asking about what types of data do we use to evaluate the success of different growth tests or to determine whether we validated a hypothesis or not, right?
Yeah, or also understanding like cohorts, like for user retention, for example.
Yeah, I think the first thing is the hypothesis has to be written very well. You have to understand what your success criteria actually are. And actually something I wanted to add to just writing good hypotheses in general, they have to be falsifiable. You have to be able to disprove them. And so you want to know like what the world looks like if this hypothesis is true and what it looks like if it's not true, which can give you a better sense of sort of where you want to look for that. And now if you're really early, data is going to be really difficult to find in any significant way that isn't just noise, in which case you are going to talk to people. You are going to draw pictures and put them in front of people and see what happens, or write pseudocode and put it in front of engineers and see what they think about moving things forward in that way. But ideally, you want to be collecting data that is going to be sort of relevant to the North Star that you're creating for the company. So if you're not going to be looking at engagement data about monthly active users down the road, don't try to use don't try to test a hypothesis with monthly active users, for instance. It's kind of a silly example, but the short version is like, and we hear this a lot from early stage companies, you just simply will not have enough data to make sense of it in the early days. And so don't build anything to start. To Nathan's point, rather than building the thing, you want to try to test the idea first. And then if you do start to need significant data, that's when it starts being a funnel question of how can I get enough people to see this thing? And then you really do want to be looking in the product analytics as deeply as possible to try to look at, find any insights there. The other thing is that this is assuming that the hypothesis is not a follow-up to another hypothesis. But a lot of the time, most of the time, unless it's the first time you're testing in a specific space, you're going to be asking, sort of follow-on questions to, one general or central thesis. So, it becomes less of a question the more testing you do, I guess. Other thoughts on that?
I think I nailed it.
Practical tips. Getting data in the early days is hard. I'm working with a company right now that I'm advising, and so we have a lot of customer interviews about their use of the product. So as a product manager, I go through all of that looking for patterns. And if you think about it, like we want to instrument the product and get more users and get the actual objective data, but actually mining that more qualitative, those interviews is what's telling me what metrics I might want to actually look for. I think there's a pattern here that represents value. Can I measure that? And so then maybe we might build something into the product that emits that metric so we can start to see, are we actually making a difference there? And then the other funny comment I'll just make, which we all know, which is, we'll just put a feedback button in your product. That'll do it. Just remember, not everyone writes the Yelp review or hits the feedback button, and you're probably more concerned about people who aren't hitting that button.
Another tip on top of your tip, because a lot of startups are asking, but how do we get those people, like to get those qualitative reviews? And the cool thing is industry event. It worked amazingly. So you define your ICP, like ideal customer persona that you think your ICP is. You find out where they hang out, like what are the offline events you can go and talk to these people. And the thing is, a lot of people that go to those events, they are there to connect with other people like yourself. And that's is the best way to test out all the hypotheses that you have.
By the way, your hypothesis is not, we think this is a really cool product. What do you think? It's, we think this is a really valuable problem in this narrow space that we're all at this event for. What do you think about that problem? I'm being a little snarky here, but often, I see all the time the hypothesis is people will buy my product. That's not the hypothesis you're testing.
Awesome. All right, I think we got time for one, maybe two more questions. Let's go right there.
Thank you. I noticed, you mentioned about to deliver faster growth, you need to be push features fast, and I wonder how fast it can be in your companies, and what are the things you have done effectively to accelerate the process. And last point, because we are kind of into like with lower cost. So we kind of need to work with them remotely. And what are the suggestions you have on to monitor the process to push it even faster when we work remotely with engineers as well? And last question, like, does it also apply to part-timers? Because we are kind of early startup, and we founders work with part-timers before, and part-timers sometimes they just don't, like, they are not able to deliver things that they promise, and sometimes they just vanish, saying like they get some depression or something. And the features are just like delayed. So I wonder like if there's any way you can also apply this kind of approaches to part-timers. And yeah, I guess that's all for my question. And luckily we just built like fundraising recently, so I think what we need to dig into is like how we can apply those fast delivery to our full-time employees worldwide. Yeah, thank you.
So to quickly summarize, I'll try, is effectively how fast can or should you be developing product, and what are some tips or approaches, and how do we deal with part-time engineers?
Yeah.
Part-time remote engineers.
What if we didn't have to deal with people? Is a question I, in my most misanthropic moments, I ask all the time. But I think that I just want to pull this right back into hypothesis land. Honestly, the shorter of a cycle you can build around what's testable, and the better you get at converting that validation cycle into something that somebody can build, the more likely you are to be able to get that out the door more quickly, test it, validate it, decide whether you delete it or build on it or whatever else. Also, people who are appearing and disappearing randomly are more likely to work on smaller chunks of stuff before they disappear. So maybe that's the answer to that question as well. But in general, like the idea of velocity and moving more quickly is about being able to fail more quickly and succeed more quickly when it comes to any hypothesis you have about the value that you're providing to your audience. If this is about building lots of features very early on because you just have nothing and you need to put something out there, that's a process question and not exactly in scope here. But that is a thing that happens. Sometimes you validate that somebody needs a widget, and you don't need to validate each individual piece of that widget because the widget looks like this, right? Then you just have to define it and build it. Sometimes it's called a feature factory, but the truth is sometimes you have to do that. So small hypotheses, easy to test, get them out there as quickly as you can.
We're a little over. I want to squeeze in at least one more question though.
Can I give I want to have one quick comment about
Sure.
the remote workers and the shipping faster. Create a culture of ownership and celebrate failure when you learn from it. So like I've created teams all over the planet, and if you enroll everyone in the mission and they feel like they're an owner and they're part of testing those hypotheses and evaluating whether they worked, that's the kind of culture that's going to allow you to build a successful company.
Yeah.
I think we, based on arm motion, we need to go with you.
Oh, sorry, you're kind of in my yeah.
I've got this. I see two exchanges up there, Steven and Nathan, as well, right? So my question is about creative tension. So when you come from an engineering background and you're doing these particular things in marketing, do you find yourself in this perplexing creative tension? I'll give you a few examples. You want to avoid sales because you're doing product-led growth, but then you go and find influencers. So then now you are in the business of selling influencers, right? You set up schedules, you call them, and you optimize that. You're in this idea of using data to drive things, but then ultimately you realize you're in a creative rut, and you're in this 80-20 thing where you're now getting, let's say, new users coming in. You're in a retention base, but let's say you want to keep on expanding. So you probably need to now venture out and kind of capture new ideas, and that's what's not going. So how important is being able to manage this creative tension a really fundamental part of what makes marketing effective?
Well, first thought is that you hit the nail on the head. There is that tension. It is always tough, especially coming in as an engineer and like trying to apply or default applying a very engineer mindset towards things. But I don't know if I have quite a great answer for that. You just kind of have to evolve. This is just what you do when leading startups, and you have to be open to a lot of different stuff.
I personally feel, if I understand your question, that that kind of tension is a really creative space when you're open to it. So that's one way I look at it as, I'm definitely an engineer, but when I'm challenged in sort of other domains, it's a really creative space. So I'm open to thinking differently or approaching a situation like a beginner or like a scientist, right? We've been talking a lot about testing hypotheses. So I think that's one way I look at it. The other way I look at it is, which maybe gets to some of your question, is sometimes thinking about things from a maturity model perspective. What are we, as a company, what hypotheses have we tested that we know are working? What are we incubating right now? What's kind of on the horizon? And so getting clear, like it's okay over here, these are incubating, it's not clear, we can be creative, we don't really know, but on these other things we actually know something. So for me, part of how I think about the creative tension in a startup is don't put all your energy into incubating things because you're gonna end up like all over the place, right? And so getting really clear on, well, we've kind of got some signal here, here's our core value, let's keep amplifying that and get it really, really good and be clear about what are we incubating.
One thing that has helped me step out of my engineer mindset is when I got into startups, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a commander of this army and we're going to like have this like grand strategy. It always felt like a brawl. Like you're just like in the dirt, like use whatever tools you have and like throw it at the other person. It was just chaos all the time. We try to structure the chaos a little bit with things like PLG, but it really is just kind of like be open to use whatever tools you have to succeed, because otherwise the company dies, and that's very sobering and just kind of opens you up to a lot of other ideas.
I think, Steven, you just said something which is a huge trap for us techies who come from engineering, which is the first thing you said, sort of trying to be the commander. Oftentimes engineers will come into a situation and try to be the smartest person in the room. Right, and think of everything like something sort of like an engineering problem that can just be decomposed and so forth. But as a leader, it's more like I am gonna give ownership, back to my other comment, to these different people on the team, and I'm gonna expect them to really own that and figure it out, because I can't go and, as an engineer, try to analyze and solve the problems in every domain in the company. So I think that's a really important lesson. We all see a lot of Silicon Valley companies that are led by the smartest person in the room, and maybe they are the smartest person in the room, but most people don't want to work for those people.
All right, we're a little over now. Guys, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for attending right now. We're going to move to the next session of the conference, but before we do, can I get a round of applause for these amazing speakers?
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.